Ted Harper never liked being told what to do. He wasn't the kind of man who sought out fights, but if someone tried to take what was his, they'd soon regret it. His warehouse was his property, his business, and his legacy. It wasn't just some empty building in an industrial district, it was the result of years of sweat and sacrifice. Every inch of the lot, from the reinforced steel doors to the gravel-covered parking area, had been carefully planned and paid for with hard work. That's why, when he returned from a 3-day trip to find strangers' cars packed into his lot like sardines and his front gate wide open, he didn't feel anger at first. He felt something colder, more deliberate, a measured kind of fury, the type that didn't burn out quickly. The first thing he noticed was the sheer audacity of it. The cars weren't just parked haphazardly, someone had organized this. There were neat rows, cars lined up with clear intent, and even folding chairs set up near the entrance, as if this was some kind of community picnic area. A battered red food truck sat parked near the loading dock, its back doors open, a man inside flipping burgers for a small gathering of people chatting and laughing like they belonged there. A few kids ran across the lot, weaving between cars, playing with a soccer ball. Ted's eyes swept over the scene, and then he saw the sign. Community parking area authorized for local residents. It was freshly printed, bolted onto the metal fencing where his own private property no trespassing sign had once been. Someone had replaced it. Someone had replaced it. Someone had decided, without asking, without warning, that his warehouse was now a shared space. He inhaled slowly, keeping his breathing steady. No sudden movements. No shouting. That's how you ended up on the wrong side of the law, and Ted wasn't about to make that mistake. He stepped out of his truck, locking the door behind him, and started walking toward the entrance. A few people noticed him, some just glanced and kept talking, but one man near the food truck turned his head fully, frowned, and nudged the woman beside him. Within seconds, the atmosphere shifted. The chatter didn't stop entirely, but it became quieter, tense, as if people were waiting for something to happen. Ted didn't stop. He moved with the kind of confidence that made people uneasy, the kind that suggested he wasn't looking for permission to be there. By the time he reached the food truck, the owner, a scruffy-looking man in his late 40s, was already wiping his hands on a rag, sensing trouble. "You lost, buddy," the man asked, his voice overly casual. Ted didn't even look at him. He stepped past the truck and yanked the sign off the fence in one smooth motion, metal screws snapping free, the plastic bending as he threw it onto the ground. The chatter died instantly. "Hey, you can't do that," the man blurted, stepping forward. Ted finally looked at him. "I just did." The man hesitated, then scowled, glancing around for backup, but no one stepped in. Ted wasn't built like a bodybuilder, but he was solid muscle, the kind of man who had spent his life lifting, moving, and fixing things without any need for a gym. His arms were tense, his posture unreadable, but his eyes, that was what made the guy back off. Ted's gaze was steady, cold, the look of someone who had already made a decision about what happened next. A new voice cut in from the side. "Mr. Harper, I was hoping we could talk before things got unpleasant." Ted turned his head and saw her. Joyce Winters, chairwoman of the local neighborhood council, always dressed in beige and navy, always standing like she was posing for a photo. She was in her 50s, with precisely cut shoulder-length hair and a permanent expression of patronizing calm. She wasn't alone either. 2 men flanked her, one of them holding a clipboard, the other wearing a security badge that didn't mean anything on his property. Ted stayed silent, waiting. Joyce smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I understand this might be a bit of a surprise, but we've actually had this planned for some time. The council voted unanimously to reallocate this space to better serve the community. The zoning records show that this lot was originally designated for mixed use, and since you haven't been fully utilizing it—" "Bullshit," Ted interrupted, his voice even. He didn't raise it, didn't need to. Joyce sighed, tilting her head slightly, as if she were a teacher dealing with an unruly student. "Mr. Harper, I don't think hostility is necessary. We tried reaching out, but you were unavailable. It's a common issue with absentee owners, but we've taken the necessary steps to ensure everything was handled legally. You'll find that. This is my property." Joyce gave a small, polite shrug. And yet, right now it's our parking lot. The words sat heavy in the air. Ted nodded slowly, looking around again, this time not at the people, but at the details. The fence was still intact except for where they had removed his gate. The loading dock had scuffed marks from cars that had backed up too close. His security cameras had been tampered with small, barely noticeable strips of tape over the lenses, not the work of vandals, deliberate, planned. He exhaled through his nose. You think this is going to stay this way? Joyce didn't flinch. We don't think, Mr. Harper. We know. And just like that, she turned and walked away, her two men following behind her. She didn't give him a chance to argue, didn't wait for him to respond. She had already won, at least in her mind. Ted stood there, letting the weight of the situation sink in. His property had been taken over while he was gone. Someone had plotted this in advance, removed his signs, blocked his cameras, and turned his warehouse lot into a public space without so much as a phone call. The paperwork was probably shady, but it wouldn't matter not immediately. If he started throwing people out, he'd be the bad guy. If he tried to fight it the legal way, it would take months. Joyce thought she had backed him into a corner, but Joyce didn't know Ted Harper. She didn't know that he'd spent his entire life adapting, outmaneuvering, and crushing obstacles without hesitation. She didn't know that he'd already decided exactly how this was going to end. Ted didn't react immediately. He had learned a long time ago that the first move in a fight wasn't always the one that mattered, it was the next five that decided everything. Instead of making a scene, he turned on his heel and walked back to his truck, ignoring the eyes following him, ignoring the murmurs of conversation that had started up again once Joyce Winters had left. He could feel them watching him, waiting to see if he'd explode, if he'd do something reckless. But Ted wasn't a man who reacted without thinking. He had no interest in throwing a punch when he could pull the ground out from under someone's feet instead. Sliding into his truck, he shut the door and sat there, fingers drumming against the steering wheel, eyes scanning the lot one last time. There were things Joyce had said that stood out, not just the words, but the way she had said them. She wasn't acting on a whim. This wasn't just the local busybodies deciding to take what wasn't theirs. This had been planned. There were too many small details for it not to be. The fake zoning change, the security cameras covered up, the fact that the entire lot had already been reorganized before he even returned. That kind of operation took coordination, people working together, a level of confidence that meant they hadn't just assumed they could get away with it, they knew they could, because they'd done it before. Ted opened the center console of his truck and pulled out his phone. He didn't call the cops, he wasn't that stupid. The police didn't rush to help business owners with property disputes, not when it was a case of community concerns versus a single man. He needed proof first, something to shove under the nose of someone who couldn't ignore it. He scrolled through his contacts and tapped a name. Ryan, he said when the call connected. I need you to pull something for me. Ryan Davies had been handling permits and zoning applications in the city for nearly 2 decades. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew where the cracks were in the system, where things got shuffled around quietly. More importantly, he knew who shuffled them. I'm guessing this isn't about a new loading dock, Ryan said dryly. No, Ted said, glancing out the window at a woman pushing a stroller through his lot like it was a damn park. I need to know when the zoning changed on my property, who signed off on it, who put it through. There was a pause, then a quiet exhale. Shit, what did they do? They think they own my lot now. Another pause. I'll call you back. Ted ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. He didn't expect Ryan to work miracles, but he would get an answer faster than any official complaint could, and if there was one thing Ted knew, it was that paper trails were never as clean as people thought. Someone had pushed this change through, and they had done it fast, which meant they had left something behind. He rolled his shoulders, exhaling slowly, and climbed out of the truck. The lot was still full, and he wasn't going to get rid of everyone in one night. Joyce had been confident when she walked away, and that confidence told Ted something important. She believed she had time. She thought he'd be stuck fighting a long battle. She was wrong. Ted walked across the lot, weaving between the parked cars until he reached the backside of the warehouse, where the service entrance was. The main doors were still locked, at least they hadn't broken in, but the gate was missing. They had cut it down completely. He could see the raw edges where the metal had been sawed through, a rough, hurried job. That was a problem. It meant they didn't just think they were legally in the right. It meant they had been willing to take physical action to make it happen. He stepped over the sawed-off remains of his own property and unlocked the side door. Inside, the warehouse was just as he had left it, silent, orderly, nothing touched. They hadn't gone inside. That was good. They thought they could take the lot, but they hadn't yet pushed into his actual business. Yet, Ted took his time walking through, checking every section, every corner, every security measure he had in place. The cameras inside were still running, untouched. They weren't worried about those, which meant they knew exactly what was watching them outside. Ted clenched his jaw. He had work to do. He spent the next 3 hours methodically reinforcing his property. He didn't have the time to put up a new gate, but he had other ways to remind people where the line was drawn. The entrances were blocked off with whatever he had on hand, heavy-duty pallets stacked 6 feet high, crates positioned strategically to prevent easy access. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it would slow them down, and more importantly, it would send a message. By the time he finished, the lot was quieter. Most of the people had left, the food truck gone, but a handful of cars remained. Ted didn't care. He would deal with them in the morning. He locked up, walked back to his truck, and sat there in the darkness, fingers tapping against the gear shift as he waited for Ryan's call. It came at 2:37 a.m. Ted, Ryan said, his voice low. "You need to see this." Ted didn't ask questions. He started the truck, pulled out of the lot, and headed to the address Ryan texted him. It was a small diner on the edge of downtown, the kind of place that never closed, where half the city's bureaucrats and lawyers ended up after hours. Ryan was already inside, sitting at a booth near the back, a thick file sitting on the table in front of him. Ted slid into the seat across from him and took one look at the documents before letting out a slow breath. "Tell me what I'm looking at," Ted said. Ryan rubbed a hand over his face. "Your lot was rezoned 6 weeks ago." Ted's jaw tensed. 6 weeks, that was before he had even left town. Ryan nodded. It was pushed through as an amended use permit under community development. The signatures check out technically. But here's the thing, he tapped the papers. The application was expedited. No public hearing, no review period. Someone wanted this done quietly. Ted flipped through the documents, eyes scanning the names. And then he saw it, Joyce Winters. Not as the applicant, as the authorizing agent. She had signed off on the paperwork herself. Ted's lips pressed into a thin line. "She told me this was a unanimous council decision." Ryan gave him a grim look. It wasn't. The decision was never even presented for a vote. This was a personal move. She used her position to push it through, and whoever was supposed to oversee it, he tapped the name of the approving official, didn't do their job. Ted stared at the name. He recognized it. A city planner with a history of looking the other way when the right people asked him to. Ted closed the file. Ryan exhaled. "Ted, I don't know what you're thinking, but—" "I'm thinking," Ted said, standing up, "that Joyce made a mistake." Ryan narrowed his eyes. "And what mistake is that?" Ted slipped the file under his arm and looked him dead in the eye. "She thought I'd take this to court." Ryan frowned. "And you're not." Ted shook his head, heading for the door. Not yet. Because the way he saw it, Joyce had cheated the system to take something from him. Now he was going to take it back. Ted didn't leave his warehouse that night. He stayed inside, lights off, watching the lot from the second-floor office window, waiting for the inevitable response. He knew Joyce wouldn't take the shutdown lightly. She had gone too far, too fast, signing off on fraudulent zoning changes, bypassing official votes, and cutting down his gate like it was some abandoned shack instead of private property. She had been confident because she had never encountered real pushback. That was going to change. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the first sign of retaliation came. The motion sensors outside triggered, sending an alert straight to his phone. Ted glanced at the screen and saw 3 figures moving through the lot, all dressed in dark clothing, all carrying tools. They weren't city officials, and they weren't random vandals. They were here for a reason. Ted moved silently through the warehouse, stepping carefully to avoid creaking floorboards. He had already prepped for something like this, knowing Joyce wouldn't play by the rules. The exterior floodlights were set up on a manual override. The security cameras were running on a separate power source, and he had locked down every entrance with reinforced steel bars. There wasn't a single exposed weak spot. Outside, the figures split up. One moved toward the main gate, another toward the back of the lot, and the third lingered near the containers he had stacked as barriers. The one near the gate pulled out a crowbar and wedged it between two metal panels, trying to pry them apart. The second man near the back took out a pair of bolt cutters and started working on the security chains. The third? He wasn't trying to break in, he was spray painting something onto the side of the warehouse. Ted exhaled slowly. That was enough. He pressed a button on his phone. The floodlights roared to life, turning the lot into daylight. The three men flinched, blinded by the sudden brightness. Ted didn't give them time to adjust. He stepped outside, shotgun resting casually over his shoulder, and made his presence known. I'd drop that crowbar if I were you. The one at the gate spun around, eyes wide. The one with the bolt cutters took a hesitant step back. The spray painter froze, still gripping the canister. Ted took his time walking forward, letting his boots scrape deliberately against the pavement, making sure they heard him coming. He wasn't pointing the gun at them, he didn't need to. The simple fact that he was standing there armed watching was enough. The man with the crowbar, tall, wiry, the type that thought he was tougher than he was, forced a smirk onto his face. You can't pull that on us, he said, voice trying to sound cocky but failing. We're just. Ted cocked the shotgun. The man shut up. The one with the bolt cutters dropped them with a loud clank. The spray painter took a step away from the wall. Ted didn't say another word. He just tilted his head toward the gate. Get out. They got the message. The three of them moved fast, too fast to be casual, stumbling slightly as they scrambled toward the exit. The wiry one tried to salvage his pride by muttering something under his breath, but he didn't stop moving. Within 30 seconds they were gone, disappearing into the night. Ted waited, listening to the sound of their footsteps fading. Then he turned to look at the graffiti. It wasn't just random tagging. It was a warning. Sell and leave. He stared at it for a long moment, then exhaled. They were getting desperate. Good. The next morning he didn't bother cleaning it up. He left it there, a visible reminder that someone had tried to intimidate him and failed. Instead, he focused on the next step. By noon, Joyce showed up again. This time she wasn't alone. She arrived in a black sedan, stepping out with two uniformed officers and a man in a suit. Ted recognized the lawyer immediately, David Kern, a corporate specialist who handled real estate disputes for high-profile clients. He wasn't cheap, and the fact that Joyce had brought him meant she was trying to put legal pressure on him. Ted met them at the gate, arms crossed. Mr. Harper, Kern said smoothly, adjusting his tie. We need to discuss your unlawful obstruction of a designated community zone. Ted didn't blink. This is private property. Kern opened a folder, pulling out a sheet of paper. As of last month, this lot has been rezoned for mixed use, allowing for community access. Your attempt to block public entry is a violation. Ted held up a different document. Your rezoning is illegal. The city official who approved it bypassed standard procedures, and I have proof of fraudulent signatures. Kern didn't flinch, but the two officers exchanged looks. Joyce stepped in, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. Ted, this doesn't have to be a fight. The neighborhood benefits from this space being shared. You're making this harder on yourself. Ted just smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. Joyce, you broke the law. You forged documents, tampered with city records, and tried to steal my property. Now you're sending idiots in the middle of the night to spray threats on my walls. Joyce's smile faltered for just a second. I don't know what you're talking about. Ted turned his phone around, showing the security footage. The three men from last night, clear as day, trying to break in. Recognize them, he asked. Joyce's face stayed neutral, but her fingers twitched. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Harper, let's keep this civil. We're prepared to negotiate a settlement. A financial incentive to relocate your operations elsewhere." Ted barked a laugh. "A bribe. A business proposal." Ted's smile dropped. "Not interested." The lawyer exhaled. "Then we'll proceed with legal action. The council will request an injunction against your blockade, and if you continue to obstruct access—" Ted stepped forward, just enough to make them uncomfortable. "You listen to me, Kern. I don't care how many suits you throw at this. I don't care how many fake documents you file. This is my property. And I'm not going anywhere." There was a long pause. Then Kern closed his folder. "Very well. We'll see you in court." Joyce nodded at the officers. "Gentlemen, I trust you'll be monitoring the situation." The cops, who had been silent the whole time, gave non-committal nods. They weren't going to get involved in something messy unless they had no choice. Ted stepped back, watching them pile into their car. He waited until they drove off, until the street was empty again. Then he turned, looked at the graffiti one last time, and finally grabbed a bucket of paint. It was time to clean up. Because he wasn't just going to fight this. He was going to end it. Ted knew he was winning. Not in the way that meant the fight was over, not yet, but in the way that told him Joyce Winters and her people were losing control. The legal threats, the late-night intimidation, the staged enforcement attempts, those were all signs of desperation. Joyce had expected him to roll over and let them take what they wanted. Instead, he had slammed the gate shut and locked them out. And now they were scrambling to find another way in. He didn't give them the chance. The morning after Joyce's latest visit, Ted took his fight to the city zoning office. He didn't go alone. He brought Ryan Davies, the man who had uncovered the fraudulent rezoning documents, and a lawyer of his own, Cal Turner. Unlike Kern, Joyce's polished corporate attorney, Turner was a different breed entirely. He wasn't the type to sit in a high-rise sipping expensive whiskey with real estate moguls. He was the guy you hired when you needed someone to tear a case apart from the inside out. They walked into the zoning office at exactly 9:02 a.m., file in hand, and requested an immediate meeting with the department head. "We have evidence of fraudulent zoning approvals," Turner said, placing the file on the desk, including forged signatures and unauthorized amendments to existing property designations. The official, a middle-aged woman named Lisa Horner, frowned as she flipped through the papers. It took her less than a minute to recognize the problem. "This approval wasn't processed correctly," she murmured, her eyes scanning the forged signatures. "There should have been a public hearing before any zoning changes were made." "There wasn't," Ryan confirmed, "because Joyce Winters fast-tracked it through someone in your office." Lisa's expression hardened. "Do you have proof that she was directly involved?" Ted tapped the document. "Her signature is on the approval form." Lisa didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she exhaled. "I need to verify this with legal." Turner nodded. "Do that. But understand this, if your office doesn't take action, we will." Lisa disappeared into a back office, leaving them waiting. The next 20 minutes felt like an eternity, but Ted didn't let himself think about what might happen if this didn't work. He knew bureaucracies moved slowly, but they also hated scandals. And that's what this was becoming. Finally, Lisa returned, looking tense. "We're freezing the zoning designation," she said. "Effective immediately. The lot will revert to its original status as private property until a formal review is completed." That was all Ted needed to hear. By noon, the entire council was informed that their so-called community lot was no longer theirs. Every sign, every permit, every excuse Joyce had used to justify the takeover, gone. But Ted wasn't stupid. He knew Joyce wouldn't just accept defeat. And he was right. At 5:46 p.m., a city inspection team arrived at his warehouse. Not zoning, not law enforcement code compliance officers. They came in with clipboards and flashlights, acting like they were conducting a routine check. But Ted wasn't fooled. This wasn't random. The lead inspector, a stiff-looking man in his 60s, introduced himself as Robert Mendez. He held up an official-looking document. "We've received a complaint about safety violations on this property," he said. We need to conduct an inspection. Ted folded his arms. Who filed the complaint? I can't disclose that information. Ted smirked. Let me guess. Joyce Winters. Mendez didn't answer. Are you refusing entry? Ted wanted to. Every instinct told him to slam the door in their faces. But he knew how these games worked. If he refused, they'd escalate. They'd get a court order, claim he was hiding something, drag it out until they found a way to shut him down. So he did the opposite. He let them in. And he watched them like a hawk. For the next hour, Mendez and his team combed through the warehouse, searching for anything they could use against him. They checked the fire extinguishers, the ventilation system, the emergency exits. One of them even measured the distance between storage racks like it was some kind of crime scene. Ted didn't say a word. He just followed them, silent and calm. And when they were done, Mendez sighed, flipping through his notes. There are some minor compliance issues, he admitted. But nothing serious. Ted raised an eyebrow. So you're saying my warehouse is up to code? Mendez hesitated, then nodded. Ted smiled. Great. Be sure to tell that to Joyce. Mendez's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He just handed over a copy of the report and left with his team. Ted watched them drive off, his gut telling him something wasn't right. Joyce hadn't expected this inspection to succeed. She had sent them in knowing they wouldn't find anything. So what was her real plan? The answer came 2 hours later. At 8:21 p.m., an anonymous email arrived in Ted's inbox. No sender name, no details, just a simple message. Check your backlot, now. Ted didn't hesitate. He grabbed a flashlight, stepped outside, and made his way to the rear entrance of the warehouse. And that's when he saw it. A stack of industrial waste barrels, dumped right against his building. It was obvious what had happened. Someone, probably the same people Joyce had sent before, had come back while the inspectors were inside. They had dropped hazardous material on his property, counting on someone reporting it later. If the compliance team had still been there, that would have been an instant shutdown order. Ted crouched, inspecting the barrels. They were old, rusted, probably stolen from another site. If they had been filled with anything dangerous, the smell would have been overwhelming. But when he nudged one with his boot, it moved too easily. They were empty. Ted exhaled slowly. This wasn't about environmental hazards. This was about creating the illusion of a violation, a setup, and Joyce had almost pulled it off. Ted straightened, scanning the lot, looking for anyone watching. But the street was empty. Whoever had done this was already gone. His phone buzzed. Another message from the same anonymous sender. You need to end this now. Ted frowned. He didn't have all the pieces yet, but he had enough. Joyce was desperate. She was pulling every trick in the book, trying to get him shut down, pushed out, eliminated. And whoever sent that message was warning him that it was going to get worse. Ted stepped back into the warehouse, locked the doors, and started making calls. Because this wasn't just about defending his property anymore. This was about taking Joyce down for good. Ted Harper had crossed into new territory. What had started as a fight to reclaim his warehouse lot had turned into something much darker. Joyce Winters and her group weren't just pushing him to give up, they were escalating their efforts in ways that bordered on criminal. The barrels dumped on his property, the compliance inspectors, the late-night trespassers, these weren't random acts. This was a coordinated campaign to break him. And for the first time, Ted understood that Joyce wasn't acting alone. The anonymous warning he'd received the night before was proof enough. Someone on the inside, someone close enough to know what Joyce was planning, was trying to tip him off. It wasn't out of kindness, though. Ted knew better than to trust anyone in this game. The message wasn't a gesture of goodwill, it was a sign that even Joyce's people were starting to crack under the pressure. And that meant he was hitting a nerve. By the next morning, Ted was already moving. He wasn't waiting for Joyce to make her next move, he was going to force her hand. The first step was securing his property. The barrels left on his lot might have been empty, but they were a clear warning. If Joyce couldn't find a real violation, she'd manufacture one. Ted called in a private hazmat team to remove the barrels before anyone could report them. The crew arrived within hours, wearing full protective gear, and loaded the rusted drums into a containment truck. It cost him a small fortune, but it was worth it. Ted didn't stop there. He upgraded the perimeter security around his warehouse, adding motion-triggered cameras, reinforced fencing, and a second layer of locks on all the entrances. The message was clear: no one was getting in without his permission. But it wasn't just about defense. Ted knew Joyce's weakness wasn't her power, it was her overconfidence. She believed she was untouchable, that her position as council chairwoman gave her immunity from the consequences of her actions. She had made a career out of bending the rules, outmaneuvering her opponents before they realized what was happening. But this time she had underestimated her opponent. Ted wasn't going to play by her rules. He started by digging deeper into Joyce's operations. With the help of Ryan Davies, he tracked down other property owners who had clashed with Joyce and her council in the past. It didn't take long to find a pattern. "She's been doing this for years," Ryan said, spreading out a map of the district on Ted's desk. "Every major zoning change in the last decade, she's been involved. And every time it's the same story: small business owners pushed out, residential lots rezoned, and the land sold off to developers." Ted frowned, studying the map. "How does she keep getting away with it?" "Connections," Ryan said. "Developers pay her to grease the wheels, and she uses the council as cover. Everything looks legitimate on paper, but it's all smoke and mirrors." Ted leaned back in his chair, letting the pieces fall into place. Joyce's scheme wasn't just about his warehouse, it was part of a larger plan to take over the entire district. And if she succeeded, she'd walk away with a fortune, while everyone else was left to pick up the pieces. But Joyce had made a mistake. She had come after someone who wasn't afraid to fight back. The next step was gathering evidence. Ted and Ryan started reaching out to former council members, disgruntled residents, and anyone else who might have dirt on Joyce. Most of them were reluctant to talk, either out of fear or because they had given up hope of ever holding her accountable. But a few were willing to share what they knew. One former council member, a man named Peter Harlan, agreed to meet Ted at a diner outside of town. Peter was in his late 60s, with a weathered face and a bitter laugh. He had resigned from the council 3 years earlier after a zoning dispute that had cost him his business. "Joyce doesn't care about rules," Peter said, stirring his coffee absently. "She cares about control. She'll do whatever it takes to get what she wants. And if you get in her way," he shrugged, "she'll make sure you regret it." Ted nodded. "Did she threaten you?" Peter hesitated, then nodded. "Not directly. But things started happening: anonymous complaints, surprise inspections, permits getting denied for no reason. It wasn't long before I had no choice but to sell." "Who did you sell to?" Ted asked. "Some shell company," Peter said. "I never found out who was behind it, but I have a pretty good idea." Ted didn't need him to spell it out. He already knew who was pulling the strings. With Peter's testimony and the documents Ryan had uncovered, Ted had enough to start building a case. But he wasn't just relying on legal channels. He knew how slow the system could be, and he wasn't about to wait months for a resolution. Instead, he took the fight directly to Joyce. 2 days later, Ted filed a formal complaint against the council, accusing Joyce of fraud, corruption, and abuse of power. He didn't stop there. He sent copies of the complaint to the local press, the city attorney's office, and every regulatory agency he could think of. He knew it wouldn't be enough to bring her down, but it would force her to play defense. Joyce didn't take the bait immediately. For a few days there was silence: no inspectors, no late-night intrusions, no new tricks. But Ted knew better than to let his guard down. And then, the retaliation came. It started with his suppliers. 2 of his regular vendors suddenly stopped taking his orders, claiming they were overbooked and couldn't accommodate him. A third raised their prices overnight, making it nearly impossible for Ted to meet his shipping deadlines. Then came the online attacks. Negative reviews started appearing on his business page, accusing him of everything from unsafe practices to shady dealings. Ted knew they were fake. Most of them didn't even match the services his warehouse provided, but the damage was done. His reputation was taking a hit, and he couldn't ignore it. The final blow came when his bank called to inform him that his business loan was being reviewed for irregularities. Ted didn't need to ask where the pressure was coming from. Joyce was trying to cut him off at the knees, to choke his business until he had no choice but to fold. But Ted didn't fold. Instead, he hit back harder. He started with the bank. Ted had spent years building his credit, maintaining spotless financial records, and establishing relationships with lenders. He wasn't about to let Joyce undo all of that with a few phone calls. He scheduled a meeting with the branch manager, bringing every piece of documentation he had to prove his business was solid. By the time he was finished, the loan review was canceled and his account was restored. Next, he tackled the online attacks. Ted hired a tech specialist to trace the IP addresses of the fake reviews, and it didn't take long to link them back to a marketing firm with ties to one of Joyce's developer friends. Armed with this information, Ted filed a defamation claim, sending a cease and desist letter to the firm and demanding the removal of the false reviews. Finally, he went after the suppliers. Ted knew most of them had been pressured into cutting ties with him, so he found new vendors, ones who weren't tied to Joyce's network. It wasn't easy, and it cost him more than he wanted to spend, but he wasn't giving her the satisfaction of seeing him struggle. By the end of the week, Joyce was on the defensive. Ted's complaint had sparked a city investigation, and the press had started asking questions about her role in the zoning changes. Her allies were starting to distance themselves, and the cracks in her operation were becoming more visible. But Ted wasn't done. He knew Joyce wouldn't stop until she was forced to, and he was ready to make sure that happened. The battle was far from over, but Ted wasn't backing down. This wasn't just about saving his warehouse anymore, it was about exposing the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Joyce had underestimated him, and now she was paying the price. Ted Harper had been fighting Joyce Winters and her network of corruption for weeks, but everything was now coming to a head. He could feel it in the way the pressure had shifted. Joyce wasn't trying to win anymore, she was trying to survive. The investigation he'd triggered had sent ripples through the city council and the zoning office, and whispers of her connections to shady developers were beginning to spread. But Ted knew this wasn't enough. Joyce had too much to lose, and people like her didn't go down quietly. The tipping point came on a rainy Wednesday morning when Ted received a call from Cal Turner, his lawyer. "Do you have time to meet?" Turner asked, his voice tense. Ted immediately knew something was wrong. "What's going on?" "I think I found the connection we've been looking for," Turner said. "But it's going to get messy." They met an hour later at Turner's downtown office. Cal's usually cluttered desk was cleared except for a single manila folder. Ted sat down as Turner slid the folder across the desk. "What am I looking at?" Ted asked. Turner leaned forward. "Financial records. These are transactions tied to a shell company, Pacific Meridian Holdings, the same company that's been buying up properties after Joyce forces the owners out. Look at who's listed as the primary beneficiary." Ted opened the folder, scanning the documents quickly. His jaw tightened when he saw the name at the bottom of one of the pages, Joyce Winters. "She's been funneling payouts through this company," Turner explained. "Every time a property changes hands, Pacific Meridian flips it to a developer, and Joyce gets a cut of the profit. It's why she's been so aggressive about the rezoning. Your warehouse was supposed to be her next big payday." Ted nodded slowly, his mind racing. "Does the city know about this?" Turner hesitated. "Not yet. I wanted to show you first. If we take this public, it's going to blow everything wide open. But it also means Joyce will come after you harder than ever. You need to be ready for that." Ted closed the folder, his expression grim. "Let her try." The next day, Turner filed the evidence with the city attorney's office, triggering an official inquiry into Joyce's financial dealings. Ted expected some kind of retaliation, and it came faster than he thought. That evening, just as the sun was setting, the power at Ted's warehouse suddenly cut out. The entire lot was plunged into darkness, and the hum of his security system fell silent. Ted didn't panic. He had backup generators, and within minutes the lights were back on. But as he checked the perimeter, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The security cameras on the north side of the lot had been disabled. Ted grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar, heading toward the damaged cameras. When he got there, he found the wiring torn out and the cameras smashed beyond repair. He scanned the area, his grip tightening on the crowbar, but whoever had done this was already gone. As he turned to head back to the warehouse, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but Ted answered anyway. "You should have walked away when you had the chance," a distorted voice said. The call disconnected before Ted could respond. He stared at the phone for a moment, then slipped it back into his pocket. He wasn't scared, he was angry. Whoever Joyce had sent to intimidate him was about to regret it. The next morning, Ted filed a police report about the vandalism and forwarded the call logs to Turner. But he didn't stop there. He hired a private investigator, someone who specialized in corporate fraud and who wasn't afraid to get their hands dirty. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Dana Blake, had a reputation for uncovering things people wanted to stay hidden. Within 2 days, Dana came back with a goldmine of information. She had traced Pacific Meridian Holdings back to several prominent developers in the city, all of whom had deep financial ties to Joyce. One of those developers had even donated heavily to her last re-election campaign. Dana also uncovered something else. Joyce had been quietly moving money out of her accounts in the last week, likely preparing to cut and run if things got too hot. "She's panicking," Dana said. "She knows the walls are closing in." Ted nodded. "Good. Let's make sure she doesn't get away." The final showdown came at a public council meeting the following Monday. The room was packed with reporters, city officials, and angry residents who had been waiting years to see someone stand up to Joyce Winters. Ted sat near the front, flanked by Turner and Dana, while Joyce sat at the head of the council table, her composure strained but still intact. The city attorney stood up first, presenting the evidence Turner had filed. He laid out the fraudulent zoning changes, the shell company transactions, and the connections to developers, each revelation hitting harder than the last. By the time he finished, the room was buzzing with whispers. Joyce tried to defend herself, but it was clear her usual tactics weren't working. The evidence was too overwhelming, and the questions from the council were relentless. When it was Ted's turn to speak, he didn't hold back. "You've spent years abusing your position," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You've bullied small business owners, lied to your neighbors, and sold this community out for your own profit. And now, you're going to face the consequences." Joyce glared at him, but she didn't say anything. For the first time, she looked truly cornered. By the end of the meeting, the council voted unanimously to remove Joyce as chairwoman and referred the case to the district attorney for prosecution. As she was escorted out of the room by security, Ted felt a wave of satisfaction. The battle wasn't over. There would still be hearings, trials, and fallout to deal with, but Joyce's reign was finished. And Ted had won. As he left the meeting, reporters swarmed him, shouting questions about how he had managed to take on someone like Joyce and come out on top. Ted didn't stop to answer. He had no interest in fame or recognition. All he cared about was getting back to his warehouse, his home. His victory wasn't about the attention, it was about proving that no one could take what was his. Not Joyce. Not anyone. The fight was over, but Ted Harper wasn't the kind of man to celebrate. For weeks, his life had been consumed by the battle with Joyce Winters, her council cronies, and the corrupt web of developers trying to force him out. Now that it was done, with Joyce publicly disgraced and facing criminal charges, the adrenaline that had kept him going was finally fading. But Ted knew this wasn't the time to relax. There was still work to do. The day after the council meeting, Ted returned to his warehouse and stood in the middle of his lot, surveying the damage. The fence was bent in places from where people had climbed over it, his gate was still missing from when Joyce's crew had cut it down, and faint remnants of graffiti. Joyce's pathetic attempt at intimidation were still visible on the walls. The lot, his once pristine space, looked like a war zone. It didn't bother him. Ted knew how to rebuild. He started by fixing the perimeter. Over the next few days, he brought in a team of contractors to install a reinforced steel fence around the entire property. The new gate was motorized and secured with a keypad system that only he controlled. He added barbed wire along the top of the fence, not because he thought anyone would try to break in again, but because he wanted it to serve as a reminder. This was his land, and no one would take it from him again. The warehouse itself needed repairs, too. Ted repainted the exterior, patched up the walls where vandals had tried to damage it, and upgraded his security system. He installed motion-triggered floodlights and replaced every camera with high-resolution models that could capture details from across the lot. His office, where he had planned most of his counterattacks, became a small fortress of its own, complete with reinforced locks and a safe for storing the documents that had brought Joyce down. As the days passed, word of his victory spread through the community. People who had once been afraid to speak out against Joyce started showing up at his warehouse, some to thank him, others to offer their own stories of how she had wronged them. Ted listened politely but didn't linger on the past. For him, it was simple: the fight was over and Joyce had lost. That was all that mattered. The only person he made time for was Ryan Davies. Over a cup of coffee in the warehouse office, Ted thanked him for digging up the zoning records that had started the chain reaction. "You didn't have to get involved," Ted said, his tone gruff but sincere. Ryan shrugged. "Someone had to. Joyce was a problem for a lot of people, not just you." "Yeah, well, most people wouldn't have stuck their necks out," Ted said. "I won't forget it." Ryan smirked. "Good. I might need a favor someday. Let me know when," Ted replied, and that was the end of it. With the warehouse secure and his business back on track, Ted finally allowed himself a moment to reflect. Sitting in his office one evening, he looked through the documents that had been used to expose Joyce. The forged zoning approvals, the financial records linking her to Pacific Meridian Holdings, the testimonies of people she had bullied. All of it was a reminder of just how far she had gone to consolidate power. But there was one document he kept separate from the others: the anonymous email he had received warning him about the barrels. He still didn't know who had sent it, and maybe he never would. It didn't matter anymore. Whoever it was had played their part, and Ted had made sure Joyce wouldn't get another chance to try something like this again. One evening, as he locked up the warehouse for the night, a familiar car pulled up outside the gate. It was Peter Harlan, the former council member who had helped expose Joyce's corruption. He stepped out, carrying a six-pack of beer and a weary smile. "Thought you could use a drink," Peter said, holding up the beers. Ted nodded and opened the gate. They sat on a pair of folding chairs in the lot, the glow of the floodlights illuminating the newly repaired fence. "I heard Joyce skip town," Peter said after a long silence. Ted sipped his beer. "Doesn't surprise me. I think she'll try to come back." Ted shook his head. "She's done here. Too many people know what she did. Even if she doesn't end up in prison, her name's dirt now." Peter chuckled. "You did a good thing, Ted. People like her don't usually get what's coming to them." Ted didn't respond right away. He stared out at his lot, and let the silence hang between them. Finally, he said, "It wasn't about doing a good thing. It was about doing the right thing." Peter nodded, as if he understood the distinction. A week later, Ted decided to mark the end of the battle in his own way. He ordered a custom-made sign for the entrance to his lot. When it arrived, he mounted it himself, bolting it securely to the new steel gate. It wasn't flashy, just a simple white sign with black letters: "Private property, no trespassing." But underneath that, in smaller print, he added one more line: "Not for sale." It was a message not just to Joyce but to anyone else who thought they could take what didn't belong to them. Ted didn't need applause or recognition. He didn't care about being seen as a hero. All he wanted was to be left alone to run his business, to live his life on his terms. And now, finally, he could. As he stood there looking at the new sign, he allowed himself a rare smile. The fight was over, and he had won. Not because he was stronger or smarter or luckier than Joyce, but because he had refused to give up. And that, Ted thought, was the real victory.